Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you tuned in today. Thanks for joining us here at the Sandwich Public Library for our event, Composting 101 with Steve Wolf. I'm very excited personally to learn from him today, and I'm sure that you are as well. I think everyone will go home with some good tips. If you're joining us live, again, welcome. Otherwise, you can find this and other programs on our program archive that's on our website. You'll hit the events tab and then adults, and then you'll see a section that says program archive, or you can go to us directly on YouTube, search Sandwich PLD, and you can see a lot of previous programs that we've had before, including Steve Wolf, who came and spoke with us last year about gardening. So you can check out his previous program he's done here. Let me give you a little bit of instruction. Down at the bottom of your screen, you should see a place that says chat and Q&A. In the chat, feel free to drop your name and how many people are viewing with you today. We'd love to keep track of how many people have enjoyed this program. And in the Q&A box, feel free at any point during the program to drop your questions for Steve there. But at the end of the program, we'll come back and touch on as many of those as we have time for together at the end. So again, welcome. I see some more folks are joining in here. So thanks for coming this morning. We're looking forward to learning together a little bit more about composting. Again, my name is Matthew Jones, and I'm the Adult Services Coordinator here at the Sandwich Public Library. And today our guest is Steve Wolf. He's a master gardener and I think also a master composter. So we're in good hands today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Steve and I'll let him join here in the screen and we'll be hearing from him. All right, let me share your slides here. Okay, thank you, Steve. Welcome.
Okay, thanks, Matt. We'll switch seats here and get started. Welcome, everybody. I almost found myself saying good morning, but it's too late for that anymore, I guess. So we're going to talk about composting today. I'm going to try to get my picture out of the way here so that I don't obstruct things, because you don't need to look at me, you need to look at the information. I am with the Kendall County Extension Office of the University of Illinois Extension. Every county has access to an extension service, and we'll talk a little more about that later. But what we're here today to learn about is how to compost at home. And this is our agenda. First of all, what compost is, types of composting, why you should do it, the basics of how to do it at home, compost problem solving, and there will be problems, you can be sure, and then what to do it with your finished product. So to start, what is compost? You probably know what compost is, but for the basic idea anyway, but there's a definition right there. It's the final product of what you get when organic matter disintegrates, decomposes through microorganisms and other little creatures in the soil, worms and other insects. Okay, here's some terms to remember. The definition for compost, we talked about organic matter means living matter that has died, whether it's plants, mostly what we're talking about, or animal matter is a part of organic matter. Dead insects and worms, and you don't want dead dogs and cats in your compost pile, but otherwise the little creatures are fine. Humus is essentially compost. It's the completely decomposed end product of organic matter. The difference is that compost is what we make at home. Humus is what nature makes. When leaves pile up in the forest and disintegrate in the fall, it's called humus, okay? Not hummus. I like hummus for lunch. I don't like humus for lunch, okay? Mulch is something totally different. Some people do put compost around their landscape plants as mulch, but compost in itself isn't just mulch. Mulch can be organic matter like wood bark, wood chips that most people use for mulch, or inorganic matter. Some people use rock or ground up rubber from tires, et cetera, et cetera. Organic matter, again, in the real world, takes a long time to create. It takes nature 100 years to make an inch of organic matter. Nature works slowly, but it works well. When you see 300-year-old oak trees around us, it works. Types of composting then. Traditional aerobic composting, which requires oxygen, that's what aerobic means, is what we're going to talk about here today. That's the common composting that's done at home. Anaerobic composting means without oxygen, and that's a system called bokashi, which comes from Japan. And we'll mention it, but we're not going to go into detail about it. And then vermicomposting means composting with worms. They help you do it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I have, just as a disclaimer, I have never done bokashi anaerobic composting, so I'm not experienced with it. I have been composting in the traditional aerobic method at home for years, and I have a worm bin for vermicomposting. So first of all, just to glance at it, anaerobic fermentation is different in the bokashi system from basic aerobic breakdown. It requires special anaerobic bacteria. It works a little faster actually, but you have to keep the stuff in sealed containers like this orange bucket he's showing here. And I'm not sure, I guess people use it sometimes for items that aren't in your normal compost bin, maybe like meat or other stuff that you shouldn't put in your regular compost. But again, we're not going to get into the bokashi system in detail here. So there you go, a worm bin. Little red wigglers, they're called. They are not earthworms, night crawlers per se. But if you want to start a worm bin, you can do that 365 days a year through the winter if you keep them indoors in a heated garage or a garage where it's not freezing. I keep mine in the basement and in the furnace room back in the corner where nobody sees them. Although when they're in a sealed bin, they're not ugly. They're just there doing their thing. It doesn't smell unless you're actively opening it up and stirring it around a bit. They will eat up the kitchen garbage that you feed them all through the winter when your compost outside is doing very little breakdown because of the winter weather. Okay? So that would be a whole nother program in its own, vermicomposting. And that's all we're going to say about it today. So a couple different types, other types of composting. You can have active or passive composting. Active composting means you're working at it, okay? You're stirring the compost, temperature gets high enough to kill weed seeds if you're doing it correctly. Whereas passive composting is kind of set it and forget it. Just pile it up and leave it. Takes much longer and it works. It just takes much longer. So why should you bother composting anyway? Well, several good reasons. You're reducing waste that goes into the landfill. Much of the garbage that people throw away from their homes that goes to fill up space in the landfill is organic matter that could have been composted. Just one comment on the kitchen garbage you're seeing here, eggshells. Eggshells are forever, okay? Do not put whole eggshells in your compost and expect them to be gone 3-4 months from now. They will still be solid eggshells. You have to break them up somehow to get them to decompose. So just as an aside. Another good reason to do it is when you get the finished product, like in the guy's hands here, you improve your garden soils by doing that. That's the main reason for doing it. You create organic amendments, soil amendments, they're called. Compost is not in itself a fertilizer, it's a soil amendment. It improves soil tilth, which means that it loosens up the soil. It does have some fertilizer-like components in it, but it's not like putting on Miracle-Gro or any other fertilizer. So then you also attract beneficial insects, both microorganisms and earthworms, to your soil, which you want. They loosen things up for the plant roots and make it that much better an environment for the plants. Some basic terms, the ingredients that you need to know if you're going to have composting at home. Organic matter, which we already talked about. Microorganisms, which you won't be able to see, of course. You won't know that they're there, but they will be there. Bacteria, fungi is a big category of microorganisms that help in the breakdown. Moisture and oxygen are two things that you need to add, okay? If you have no oxygen, then you're going to be practicing anaerobic composting, which we're not talking about here. So just leaving it open to the air provides oxygen. That's all you need to do other than stirring it up. Excuse me. You must have moisture. Moisture helps break down the organic matter. If it stays dry, it stays solid much longer. But too much moisture, on the other hand, makes a mess. One of the rules of composting, do not put in chunks of meat, fats, or oils, okay? And why not? Because they decompose very slowly, and that provides prime food for unwanted visitors. Trying to get rid of this bar on the bottom. Maybe if I move it to the top. The bar of Q&A and chat. Okay. Just blocking some of the language. One time about 10 years ago or so, I did have an open compost pile at home, and I did find one of these lovely creatures crawling around in it, a rat. Not something you typically think of in a small town environment like Sandwich. I live in town, not out in the country. Of course, they're there in farmland, and they're there in the cities. You hear about that all the time. But, I hope we'll never see them again. So, organic matter that we need in our compost bins are called greens and browns. Green matter, which isn't necessarily always green in color, but a lot of it is kitchen garbage primarily. Browns are dried up natural organic matter, primarily fall leaves, okay, which means you really only have them in the fall unless you save piles of them to add to your compost, which I do sometimes. So the greens and the browns, the green matter supplies nitrogen to the compost, which is in fact a fertilizer, and the brown matter supplies carbon. Greens can be food scraps, veggies, fruit primarily. I see this appears to be a corn cob in here, okay? I would not put corn cobs whole after eating sweet corn in my compost. They will take a long, long time to decompose. Okay, that's one thing besides eggshells, as I mentioned earlier, that takes a long time. Grass clippings, fine for your compost in most cases. And other green landscape waste. Leaves from trees and bushes that you might prune off as long as you don't have big honking branches in there, because wood itself also takes a long time to decompose. Do you have to be concerned about grass clippings if you have your lawn treated by Spring Green or True Green or anyone else, or yourself for that matter? And the answer is yes and no. If you're just fertilizing your lawn, that's fine in the compost pile. That fertilizer will transfer over from the blades of grass, that nitrogen, into your compost, wherever you're putting it. However, if you have broadleaf weed killer in your compost, you need to wait a while after applying it to the lawn. Do not take the first couple of lawn mowings into your compost, because they will still maintain some, not the full dose of broadleaf weed killer, but they could affect some plants. Okay, so just be a little careful with that. Should I be concerned about weed seeds? Yes, you should. Do not put dandelion heads like this in your compost, okay? Unless you have a really hot compost pile that kills the weed seeds, which means over 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the center of the compost. If you don't have that, your weed seeds are going to transfer to your vegetable garden when you put your compost in there. And the same thing would go for vegetable seeds. If you throw old tomatoes in your compost pile, which I do, and peppers and other things that might have seed in them, if those seeds aren't killed by the heat of the compost pile, they will provide you volunteers in the vegetable garden next year. So, especially the big seeds, squash, pumpkins, like that, you will be digging them out of your garden unless you like to let your volunteers grow. So the other part of the deal is brown matter. As I said, it's mostly fall leaves, but you can use end of season cuttings, stalks from perennials, weed stems if you don't have seed. It's hard to tell what this picture is that's on here. If they are branches from trees, I would not put them in my compost directly. I would start a separate brush pile for those to let them decompose on their own. And then some manure. If it's well seasoned, you can't take fresh manure from cattle or horses and put in your compost in your vegetable garden. It needs to sit and season. Usually it's mixed with straw from the stalls in a horse stable or wherever it's come from, but it still needs time. And size matters in composting. The smaller the pieces you put in your pile, the faster they break down. So if you put a whole cucumber that's turned bad in your refrigerator, a whole big fat cucumber into the compost pile, it will last a lot longer than if you cut it up into pieces and put it in. Okay? The same way, the same reason that tree trimmers chop up their waste products. They want to make mulch. In this case, they're not making compost usually, but cut it up. That means cut up the vegetable matter in your kitchen too. Don't throw in a whole head of lettuce that you don't want. Just take a few minutes and chop it up. Watermelon rind, muskmelon rind, it's all perfectly good in there, but better not to throw in huge whole chunks. Okay? In the ideal aerobic compost pile, you have a 1-to-1 green and brown ratio, but that's not realistic, okay? Doesn't always work that way because, like in our house, most people generate a lot more green matter from kitchen waste than you have brown matter from fall leaves. Unless, as I said, you stockpile your leaves for use throughout the year. If you have too much brown in the fall and they're not breaking down fast enough, wet them so they're not perfectly dry, and then add some basic 10-10-10 fertilizer. That will help break them down. If you have too much green, just add more brown, okay? And that's the most common problem, as I mentioned. You get too much kitchen waste, wet, damp, vegetable and fruit matter, Coffee grounds also. Coffee grounds and the filters that you use can go right in your compost pile, but coffee grounds typically bring a lot of water with them. So they soggy up your compost pile. And then you need to add more browns. And if you don't have leaves, you add the other browns, okay? Paper, shredded paper, or at least torn up paper. Newspaper like this, if you have a big Chicago Tribune or Aurora Beacon or anything like that, it will shred nicely for you in your hands if you don't have a shredder. Any paper that you shred, even if it's important documents, bills and such you want to get rid of, it's just paper. It can go in a compost pile and will disintegrate. And I doubt that any of the bad guys are going to go through your compost pile and try to steal your identity. Whereas they might go through your recycling if you just throw your ID paperwork in recycling. Never a good idea. You can also use cardboard. Again, not big, heavy stuff. Cut it up, tear it up, break it up, but cardboard is natural matter, organic matter, and it will dissolve eventually. You can use whole big boxes, cardboard boxes, opened up, laid out on the ground, and pour mulch over top of it to keep the weeds down. That's another option for using these. But newspaper is about the only thing that I find that works real well for drying up a compost pile that's too wet. Okay. Bread is another item. I throw old bread, old dried up bread or moldy bread that might have sat too long into the compost, and that's fine. It will absorb the moisture too and disintegrate. So will paper towels that have been used. Okay. So containing your compost, everybody has to have some method of containing the compost. And we're going to show you several different options here now. This is just a picture of one type of a bin. You can see how it's open to the air. That's essential. It has to get oxygen into the pile. It's also open at the top to rain so that it can stay wet. Okay. Various methods of containing your compost bins of all kinds, both homemade and commercial. Basic just compost piles. Some people just pile it up in the backyard somewhere. Again, if you just have an open compost pile, you're open to visitors that you may not want. Fencing, people use chicken wire fence or any other kind of fencing to create a compost pile. Other people, if you have the option to do that, dig a pit and bury it. Not real deep, but a few inches under the ground, and then you can go back and get it next year when it disintegrated. Now there's going to be several pictures here of different types of compost bins, but things to consider when you're determining how you want to keep your compost at home. Number one, your time. How much time do you have to work with it? We talked about passive composting a few minutes ago, where you just throw it in a pile and leave it. That's for people who don't have any time to work with it. Okay. Cost is an issue. Lots of commercially made bins like this are available in all shapes and sizes, but not for free. Okay. You have to pay for them. You can mail order them through all kinds of companies. You can buy them at Burl King or other stores like that. Your size needed, okay? How much compost are you going to generate? For the average kitchen home garbage, probably one of these is fine. But once you start adding fall leaves, if you have trees at all, and we have a lot of trees in our yard, way more space than this that's shown right here would be needed. You also have to have accessibility to turning the compost pile if you want to have active compost that dissolves faster. And then you have to have ease of removal from wherever you're storing it to get it out and use it in the garden. Here's a couple other options. Homemade wooden bins, chicken wire fence full of leaves. I've done that a couple of times in my garden in the fall, just fence it all in. One time then I went in the spring because I had left one section open so I could pour leaves into it. Went back in March to start getting some out and found a nest of baby rabbits right deep in the middle of the pile, which the mother rabbit loved because she was fully secure. No one knew she was there. So I left them for a couple of weeks until they went away on their own. Here's another option. This kind of bin is full of holes, as you can see, for aeration. The top can come off for dumping stuff in and letting rain in. There are doors both here and lower down at the bottom, which can open up to rake out compost. Okay. It looks great, not always so easy to work with though. It's pretty hard to get in there to turn that kind of a pile. So it takes longer. Here's another bin built out of pallets. Old lumber, old treated lumber used to be treated with stuff called CCA. And the A in that stands for arsenic, which of course most people know is a poison. So that's been illegal since 2003 to use that chemical to treat treated lumber that you buy. Not all pellets are treated. Some are what they call heat treated rather than pressure treated. So it shouldn't be a problem with newer pellets or newer treated lumber. But if you're using old stuff, you probably don't want to use it in making compost that will go directly into the food garden that you eat from. Another kind of a container, same kind of deal with the opening at the bottom, but you notice this has no openings anywhere on it for air or rain to get in, unless maybe there's an opening at the top for rain. I can't tell from here. Personally, I would not buy one like that. Many farmers and other big commercial composting organizations build bins out of concrete block, which is just fine. Again, it's open to the air. Something this big though is usually turned with the bobcat or some kind of heavy equipment. You're not gonna work that with your hand shovel unless you're crazy. Okay, some common problems that you might see with composting. Number one is always odor. It doesn't smell as bad as people think it might if it's handled properly, okay? But it can if it stays too wet. Compost might bring pests. We talked about that once earlier. And a common problem that people have in home composting is you get too much of any one thing. Usually too much of green matter, which is wet, and you don't have brown matter to dry it out, to add the carbon. So let's talk about some of those problems. Number one concern, odor. If you have a pile like this, it's going to stink. Okay? It's wet kitchen garbage. You can probably see some eggshells in here. You certainly would not want that laying open in your backyard. From materials that are too wet, some of the solutions, stir the pile more often, add more dry matter, whether it's newspaper, shredded paper, paper towels, whatever, or use what they call exhaust pipes. And only the largest compost piles or bins use exhaust pipes. Here's a picture of a farm setup where they have put perforated PVC pipe into the piles that allow air in and out and moisture to go through also. Most people who compost at home don't have a need for these, but that is an option. Again, a second problem besides odor is potentially bringing pests into your yard. It isn't really that big of a deal unless you have a wide open compost bin where you're pouring your kitchen garbage right out onto the pile. Use exclusion, okay, as it says here, I mean, keep them out. Chicken wire fencing will work well for a lot of them, although some of the pests that we're talking about can burrow under it or can climb up and over it, like raccoons. If you don't put meat or oils in it, there'll be less attraction for them, but they still will like fresh kitchen garbage too, vegetable matter. So you do have to be aware of that. Here's a visitor right here, and he's telling you, go away, come back later. He's helping you compost. Okay. Securely covered bins, though, if this bin had its lid securely on top, he would not have been able to get in there. I have never had an animal in my compost bins other than the year that I did an open compost bin and pile in the backyard. So your finished product ideally would look beautiful like this. Dry, crumbly, almost looks like soil, but it's not black, it's brown usually. Getting this perfect compost is not as easy as it sounds. You have to have good combination of wet and dry matter. You have to have oxygen into it, which means you have to turn it regularly. There wasn't a picture in amongst the compost bins shown in this presentation, but there are plenty of types of compost bins that are up on stands that allow you to spin them with a crank or a hand turn of some kind. And that I have 2 of those at home, and they work very well. They spin easily. They mix up the stuff that's inside it. It's still an issue though, unless you keep adding enough brown matter, enough dry matter, leaves, newspaper, whatever. You still have to get it proper mix to make it work well. When you're done, you ideally should not be able to see any chunks of your kitchen garbage, and it should not stink, and it should be this texture, okay? That's the ideal. So what do you do with it then? Well, most people just add it to the garden, vegetable garden, landscape garden, whatever. Till it into your soil. Dig it in with a spade or a fork. Some people use it as top dressing. Whether you have fruit trees, grapevines, you can just lay the compost as mulch around the tree trunk, for instance, and it will filter down in gradually, okay? You can make what's called compost tea. Actually, the composter makes it for you itself. If your compost is wet, put it somewhere like in a wheelbarrow maybe, or in a bucket, and add a little more water to it. That water will leach through the compost and give you what's called compost tea, which is just high fertility water. Then you take that and water your plants with it. Okay. You can also just save your compost as starter for your next compost pile. When you finish one off, I always leave a little bit to start the next one. Okay. And remember, this is what you're trying to do, get beautiful looking produce like this from all of these compost added soil mixtures at the bottom, okay? How about this one? Your vegetables will love you for it. Let me get my picture out of the way there. Compost is hot stuff, and a rind is a terrible thing to waste. Okay, as I said earlier, we would have some information about the Master Gardener programs with the University of Illinois Extension. Kendall County's office is on Route 47, south of Yorkville, and just south of the Route 71 intersection. Sarah Fellerer is the coordinator. I'll leave this up for a few seconds. You can get the phone number if you need to, or the email address. And you know that you may or may not know that we offer a help desk for gardeners where you can email in questions to this email address, or you can call. They're available right now, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings from 9 to 12:30. If you would be at all interested in ever becoming a master gardener, Sarah's the person to talk to. Give her a call now because she's actually holding a virtual open house for potential new master gardeners coming up next week, one evening. I'm trying to remember the date, and I think it's the 22nd, if I remember right. So contact Sarah about that. Okay, end of show. Time for questions if you have any. So let's open the Q&A here and see. And it looks like right now there are no open questions. Let me go into the chat and see. The chat is not here, Matt. Went away. I'll go into more, okay. Right at the top. Karen from Ottawa, and it's just me. Thanks, Karen. So we'll wait a second and see if there are any other questions. Looks like we are up to 7 people in attendance today. Hi, Ryan Maloney.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for sharing your expertise. Oh, it does look like a question got dropped in here.
One question. How do you mix in food scraps? Okay, most people will have some kind of compost bucket in the kitchen where you can conveniently dump your food scraps. Again, as I said, if they're large chunks like watermelon rind, cut them up a bit, makes it easier to compost them. I put them in the bucket, and as soon as I feel like it, depending on how ambitious I am or how lazy I am, I take it out to the compost bin and just dump it in. And then because mine is a spinner, I spin them around. Do you shred leaves? I don't always, but it's better if you do. Again, like cutting up watermelon rind, if you cut up your leaves, they will disintegrate faster and become compost even better. Let's see if anything else comes up.
Another question for you, Steve. When you have one compost pile, you mentioned the idea that when it's done, you'll use that as a starter. If you're continually adding to the same compost pile, how do you ever have a finished, how do you ever get to a finished compost pile?
Good question.
So do you have more than one going usually?
Yes.
Okay.
I have 2 going. I have a unit that has 2 side-by-side spinners. One has it on its door, it says start. The other one says finish. Okay. So you keep pouring things into the start bin, spinning it and working it until it gets pretty much full. Then you take that lid off and you switch the lids and you put the finish lid on there and you add compost to the other one.
Okay.
That's how I do it.
Okay, excellent.
People who have like some of those bins outside with multiple side-by-side bins, same idea. You pour everything into one until at some point you stop, whether you wait to get totally full or not, or you just decide to stop at some point and then start pouring the kitchen waste into the other, or your yard waste.
Sure.
Another question popped up. Do you recommend having a lid to control moisture and rain? Mine are closed that don't allow rain to get in, because my problem is more often having too wet of a compost pile in the bin. So I'm continuously adding leaves or newspaper to try to get it to dry out better. If you're open to the air outside, it's going to naturally dry out more and faster. So it's probably good to leave it open to the rain. That is, if it ever rains again this year. The third driest spring in Chicagoland history since 1876, from March to now. And last summer was very hot and dry in July, August, if you remember. So it's changing our climate a little bit right now.
Tell us a little bit about how often you would have a finished pile. Is this like once a year, or is it multiple times a summer?
Yeah, it depends.
Okay.
Some people do it just once a year.
Mhm.
They just let it go, keep stirring it, and then like every year in the fall, for instance, when your garden is done, you pour it out there in the garden and till it in. I can do it usually spring and fall. That's how I do it. It's twice a year. It's really difficult to get food waste into compost much quicker than that.
Mhm.
If you ever see, excuse me, commercial compost bins, where I've toured a couple of places, whether it's associated with a landfill in a garbage dump or just a compost manufacturer,
Mhm.
they pile it up so high and so thick and so deep that you can see the steam coming out of the middle of it. It gets so hot in the middle that it does break down very rapidly with that kind of heat. But it's almost impossible to get that in a home compost setting. So, another question. Excuse me. Do you need to amend with fertilizer if you use compost regularly? I don't fertilize my entire garden, and I do use compost regularly, and things grow nicely. Excuse me. Talking too much. But it never hurts to add fertilizer to specific plants rather than trying to fertilize the entire garden. What do you do with yard waste that you can't compost, such as weeds with seeds? Excuse me, yeah. Well, you can bag them in the usual brown bags and put out for pickup. If they go to a commercial composter, the weed seeds will die in the heat of their compost, as I was talking about. If you're allowed to burn wherever you live, you can burn them. As long as you only burn dry material that will burn, and don't do what I hate seeing people do, where they pour wet leaves and wet grass in a pile, throw a match on it, and let it smolder for days and smoke up the neighborhood. Not a good idea. Okay. I don't see any more questions right now.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for your time and your expertise.
You're
and
welcome.
you've
You're
certainly given me great direction, and I know what changes I need to go home and make.
Okay.
So thank you so much.
And good luck, Maloney family, with your composting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll look forward to seeing you at a program real soon, and seeing you around the library. Thanks, everyone.
Bye now. So all this is not visible to them, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
So it's obstructing my view of my content, but